If you were to go back to China in the early 1930s and were to tell the common man from, say, Shanghai that mainland China was going to be run solely by the Communist Party, there's just no way that they would believe you. If you were to then say that Mao Zedong would be the leader of that party, they would be utterly astonished. During the Nanjing decade, the decade of Chiang Kai-Shek's rule on the mainland, the retreating Communist Party had much more of an international flavour. They were closely linked with the Soviets and backed by Comintern, Lenin's International Congress of Communist Governments. And as far as the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party went, Mao Zedong was considered a fringe voice that did not understand the teachings of Marxism. Yet the Communist Party badly failed to resist Chiang's Kuomintang in the early 1930s, and the old guard was ousted for Mao Zedong. Yet as he ascended to leadership, Mao decided to keep one member from the old leadership. There was one person Mao thought was worth keeping around. In today's video, we're going to answer the question, who was Mao's reluctant enforcer, Zhou Enlai?
Hello there.
Okay, so in episode 2 of our Characters of Communist China series, we're looking at the life of Zhou Enlai. And after watching this video, let me know in the comment section below, was Zhou Enlai canny, a coward, or simply a casualty of Mao's Cultural Revolution chaos? As always, with these brief bios, we will miss details of Zhou's life, so feel free to add anything in the comment section below that I missed. So, Zhou Enlai was born in... So, let's actually skip to what you're interested in. So basically, when Zhou was a university student, he went to study in France and in 1921 joined a Chinese communist cell. And so this is actually important because there was a difference between the European communism of Vladimir Lenin and the communism that Mao Zedong believed in. Now remember, I'm not a communist, so I won't be able to represent these views as well as someone who actually believes them, but here was the basic difference. In, say, pre-revolution Russia, the downtrodden members of society were the factory workers in the cities. A lot of rural peasants were actually pretty wealthy and they were given a name, the kulaks, and so for Lenin, the communist revolution had to begin with the factory workers in the cities. However, in China they were much less industrialized, and so the cities were the centers of business, and in places like Shanghai, of hedonism. And so for Mao, he believed that the revolution had to begin from the rural peasants because they were the downtrodden in Chinese society. And so like I alluded to at the start, Mao's perspective was a minority perspective within the Chinese Communist Party, and he was seen as something of a heretic. And the Chinese Communist Party was run by people who held the same view as Lenin. And so for Zhou Enlai, he was a student who was living in Paris, and as a young man, he was in awe of what Lenin's Bolsheviks pulled off in Russia by overthrowing the provisional government. And so Zhou came back to China in 1924 as a conventional communist rather than a believer in Maoism. Now, during 1924, the Chinese Communist Party and the Kuomintang were part of the United Front in an effort to rid China of its warlords who were controlling huge swathes of land. And so Chiang Kai-Shek, who wasn't the leader of the Kuomintang just yet, but was still very powerful, had a military academy called the Whampoa Military Academy, where he trained soldiers to fight against the warlords. And so Zhou Enlai returned to China to hold a position, we don't really know what, at the academy. And so as we saw with the Chiang Kai-Shek episode, and if you haven't seen it, check it out here, the United Front would last up until 1927. You see, as Chiang Kai-Shek advanced northwards and took land back off the warlords, it would be at Shanghai where Zhou was double-crossed. Up until Chiang arrived, Zhou played a pivotal role in weakening the warlord in Shanghai. For example, in March of 1927, he helped coordinate 600,000 writing workers who cut power and telephone lines and then seized the post office and police headquarters. With this sort of pressure being applied, the warlord, Sun Quanfang, was effectively forced to withdraw. But then Chiang arrived the very next day after the withdrawal and declared martial law in the city and then purged the communists who had done the heavy lifting.
What bus driver? School's out. Time to go. It's not what happened to the rest of the guys.
And so Zhou Enlai fled to Wuhan and the United Front was over. But while in Wuhan, Zhou received a promotion to be the head of the party's military department. In July of 1928, the party held its 6th session of Congress, and it was there where Zhou shocked the party by saying that Mao Zedong actually might have a point. At this point, Zhou was Mao's superior and basically said that what they were doing wasn't working and that they needed to focus on bringing the masses from the countryside on board. A couple of years later, Zhou moved to Jiangxi where Mao was stationed, and the communists whose headquarters had been in urban cities moved their headquarters to Jiangxi. This massively increased Mao's power base because they had all come to him. However, Zhou initially tried to wrestle power away from Mao, but eventually he'd concede and more or less publicly apologized that the party hadn't listened to Mao all along. There was no time to unpack any of this though, because Chiang Kai-Shek's army was on the doorstep of Jiangxi trying to purge the communists. And so the communists did the unthinkable and fled, marching 6,000 kilometers to Shanxi on foot. This was known as the Long March. And Zhou played a pivotal role in this. While Mao mapped out the broad route that would be the safest to go, Zhou took care of the details and the stops. And so by the time of the Long March, at least the end of it, it was clear that Mao was the leader of the party and that Zhou had taken on the role of his close assistant. And so now I'm going to skip to World War II. The KMT and the Communists got back together to form a second united front to fight off the Japanese, and so Zhou had the crucial role of being the Communist Party's representative in Wuhan, which was Kuomintang territory. Zhou was in charge of propaganda and putting a spin on the grim reality that Japan was really pillaging China. For example, in 1938, after China successfully defended Taizhuang, Zhou coordinated over 400,000 people to take part in a parade with over 1 million yuan raised in funds. When the war ended and Zhou returned to Yunnan, which is where Mao was now based, Mao gave him scathing criticism for collaborating so closely with Chiang Kai-Shek. Zhou offered self-criticism and vocalised his support for Mao Zedong thought. Now, when it came to Zhou's role in the Chinese Civil War that came after World War II, he was mainly important at the end of the war as the Communist Party's chief negotiator with Chiang Kai-Shek's losing KMT army. Chiang was off in Taiwan and Zhang Zhizhong was the KMT's negotiator. However, he needed Chiang's approval for just about anything. Zhou basically said that was a joke and he gave him a list of demands to be met. After 5 days, those demands were not met, and evidently, this unsettled score has some pretty huge implications for today.
It's our policy that we would defend ourselves by ourselves. Taiwan is absolutely committed to defend itself. But tell China that the invasion, the war is not right.
And so with the Civil War over, and with Mao declaring the People's Republic of China, Zhou Enlai effectively had one job: make Mao's government seem legitimate to the rest of the world. You see, the rest of the world was very confident that Chiang Kai-Shek would win the Civil War, and certainly hadn't banked on Mao Zedong winning. Even for the Soviet Union, they viewed Mao's government as simply a bunch of farmers and not learned Marxist-Leninists. So Zhou pulled a few strings. Firstly, he recruited non-CCP figures into the government, including intellectuals, military leaders, and even Sun Yat-sen's widow, Sun Qingling. He then persuaded India to be a neutral mediator between the USA and China during the Cold War, and he even flew to the USSR to meet Stalin in an attempt to persuade him into providing China with equipment for the Korean War. When Stalin died in 1953, it was Zhou and not Mao who represented China at the funeral. Now, in 1958, Mao began China's Great Leap Forward, where he would set extreme industrialization targets and tried to create farming communes that would produce huge crops to feed the factory workers. Again, Mao was a big picture guy and didn't really have the detailed 42-step plan of how to reach those targets. And so again, this is where responsibility would be given to Zhou. In 1956, he was made one of the 4 vice chairmen of the party. And in terms of how he implemented Mao's Great Leap vision, it's a contested area of history. For example, Frank Dakota argues that Zhou was the midwife who made Mao's nightmares a reality by refusing to clash with Mao and by placing unrealistic quotas on communes, which then forced them to fabricate data to meet them. However, others argued that he softened the blow of the Great Leap by trying to rehabilitate purged scientists and officials. With 30 million deaths, the Great Leap clearly didn't work out as planned, and along with Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, Zhou worked to undo Mao's reforms as he took a backward step from running the country in 1962. But by 1966, Mao feared his revolution was being undone by the three, and so began his Cultural Revolution in an effort to wrestle back the party and therefore control of China. Mao removed both Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping from their post, which Zhou protested and said that they should be allowed to return to work, which put him in the firing line next. Mao's new clique, which featured guys like General Lin Biao, suggested that Zhou himself might be a counter-revolutionary for coming up with such an idea. Zhou backtracked quickly and gave his support for Mao's Red Guards. These were the students who were self-appointed soldiers and beat up those who were considered not true Maoists. But this effectively meant that he supported their attacks on Deng Xiaoping and Liu Shaoqi.
Avada Kedavra.
Zhou's reluctance to oppose Mao kept him in the fold. In 1966, Lin Biao was appointed as Mao's only vice chairman, but Zhou kept his spot at number 3 within the party. In 1971, Mao grew suspicious of Lin Biao with his control over the military and probably shot his plane down. Zhou then got the call up to be Mao's number 2, but Mao was clear about one thing: Zhou was not going to take over from Mao when he died. But as Mao's number 2, Zhou actually wielded a lot of influence. He secretly met with Henry Kissinger in 1971, and then in 1972, when Nixon met with Mao, it was Zhou Enlai who was the one who talked specific terms such as what to do with Tibet. Zhou also tried to scale back the Cultural Revolution and minimise the degree to which Red Guards were ravaging China in the name of Mao. This drew much criticism from Mao's wife, Jiang Qing, who mercilessly criticised him as a traitor of the movement. Now, in 1972, Zhou was diagnosed with bladder cancer, and as a member of the Politburo, the inner circle of the Chinese government, Zhou actually had to get approval from Mao before having surgery. And so here's the crazy thing: Mao refused. Though Zhou was a competent operator, he was part of the crew that attempted to scale back Mao's Great Leap reforms, and he couldn't risk Zhou taking control of the party once he died. Zhou died just months before Mao in 1976 to much public mourning. However, none of that came from Mao himself. He made no comment on Zhou, didn't attend his funeral, and forbade CCP officials from wearing black armbands at the funeral. He also rejected attempts at having Zhou publicly named as a great Marxist. It was Deng Xiaoping who gave the eulogy at his funeral, and I'll finish with his words. We should follow his example of adhering to the proletarian style and opposing the bourgeois style of life. A veiled dig at the sitting chairman. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, make sure to check out our other Chinese history videos here, and we can't wait to see you next time for our next venture into a fascinating part of history.